Okay, great. So now that you've had some time to make up your decisions on the trolley car dilemmas, we're going to talk a little bit more now about how you made those decisions. Was it a gut feeling, a rationale, or did you put a principle to it? Did you apply some kind of idea or thought process that helped you work your way through making your own decisions? And we're going to talk a little bit about ethical theory. So we're going to talk about how you've made that decision and maybe look at different viewpoints. And then we're also going to talk a little bit more about what ideas are out there and what ethical theory actually looks like. So we're going to focus specifically on Western theory, though there's a lot of other theories out there and other ethical ideas. We're going to focus solely on those Western ideas. So let's look at ethical theory as a whole. Let's talk about it. What is the actual definition of ethical theory? So we apply ethical theory to help us make ethical choices. And what this will help us do is make a framework, kind of put together our logical steps and reasons so that we're relatively consistent when we're faced with multiple scenarios. So like in your trolley car dilemma, you had 3 scenarios, but you should have applied a very similar framework to deciding how you were going to handle those 3 different dilemmas. So that's what ethical theory is. It's really putting a framework together, personal in your case, to making decisions and trying to remain fairly consistent in those. Ethical theory can be broken up into 2 main houses, if you will. The first house falls under what's called character-based ethical theory. In character-based ethical theory, we're talking about the ethics of being, of existing. And we can trace this back to Aristotle and the very early Greeks and their idea of what makes a good person. In those days, those philosophers would ask themselves those questions. What makes a good person? And they used to believe that whatever was right or wrong depended on traits that we value as a community. And we all have different traits that we value, but things such as compassion, wisdom, honesty, courage would be traits that we're talking about here. And the idea was that if you possessed each of these traits, we're using these 4, compassion and courage and wisdom and honesty. If you possessed those 4 traits, then you would be able to make good ethical decisions. So character-based ethics really kind of falls onto that idea of right versus wrong, good versus evil, as it applies to an individual. The second house is what's called action-based ethical theory. And action-based ethical theory is, as you can imagine, based on the ethics of doing, physically going out there and doing. And philosophers in those days would ask themselves, what is the right things to do? Not what makes a good person, but what is the right thing? And what is right or wrong would depend on what you're doing and why you are going about doing it. Now, action-based ethical theory can be broken down into 2 different parts as well. And so the first of those parts is what we call deontological ethics. And deontological, or deon, can be defined as the word duty. It determines what is right or wrong based on your obligations or your duty as an individual. These are the principles or ideas that govern us as a people, and they're usually set forth by leaders, religious leaders or political leaders or things like that. There are things that we should and should not do. So our example there is the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill is an idea of a principle that governs us as an individual. The most famous deontological philosopher is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in 1796 said, "Let justice be done though the world perish." These individuals, these deontologists, like Immanuel Kant, they care about the law. They don't care what the reasoning is for doing something or the outcome, but only that it is your duty to abide by the law. So, thou shalt not kill, a deontologist is going to say, that's it, thou shalt not kill. There should be no gray line here. It's a black or white scenario. Thou shalt not kill. So a deontologist is not really so much concerned with, well, what if you're defending yourself or some of these other ideas? That is the rule, that is the law, and that is what you're going to follow. The other version of this, or the other half of the individuals, are what are called teleological ethicists. And these are individuals that determine what is right based on consequences and the outcome of making that decision. Teleo is a term that means ends. ENDS means ends. And so basically what it stands for is the end. Do the ends justify the means in the case of this particular decision? The most famous philosopher of teleological ethics is Jeremy Bentham, and he was around at the same time, 1776, a few years earlier, but his idea is that it's the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right or wrong. So in this case, we're talking about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And Jeremy Bentham was that. He was the father of what's called utilitarianism, which is that idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So in this particular type of ethics, you would look at the pros versus the cons. You would make a list of pros, you would make a list of cons, and then you would make your decision based off of where would the most people benefit? What would they most benefit from? So teleological ethics really is all about looking outward, whereas deontological is kind of looking inward, looking at self versus looking at the whole globe. All of this kind of can be tied up to a more common modern view of bioethical theory. So we talked about those other ideas, or the historical ethical theories. So now if we look at the modern bioethical theory, which really began to form itself in the 1960s in medical ethics specifically, American philosophers are the ones that kind of came out and started talking about what are the principles here of making theories, of making decisions, ethical decisions. So here are the 4 ethical considerations that they talked about. And these are 4 that we're going to revisit many, many times. So you may want to jot these down on a side notebook or in your notes and make sure that you're able to go back to them. But the 4 ethical considerations are autonomy, which is the idea of self and self-direction; beneficence, which is the idea of doing good, being a good person, going back to that idea of character-based ethics; non-maleficence, which is the idea of doing no harm. It's a little different than the idea of doing good. It's the idea of not harming versus just being good. And then, of course, the ethical consideration of justice, which is all about fairness, weighing the right and the wrong and the consequences and everything all at once. So all these 4 principles, if you work them together and you discuss them right, would help you to decide the right and the wrong. And so we're going to revisit this. This is going to be our 4 principles that we're going to use for every case study from now forward, as we're going to look at these ideas of these 4 ethical considerations. So you're going to go back and revisit these. I would like you to go back and look at your classmates' responses, and I'd like you to respond to 2 students, and this is the responses in the trolley car dilemma. Respond to 2 of your classmates and look at all of these things we've talked about, deontological, teleological, and the principalism ideas, and see if their idea or their decision making in the trolley car dilemma matches somewhere along the lines of these historical or current ideas of bioethical theory. And so this will get us started on trying to make sense of how we make these decisions, and we will talk again soon.